My name is Jimmy Bellamy and I'm 27 years old. Get out and stay out, my dad yelled, his voice cracking the walls of the house I grew up in. I stood in the doorway of my childhood bedroom with a single duffel bag in my hand, watching his face turn the shade of red I remembered from every argument we'd ever had, except this time there was no coming back from it. My mother stood behind him, arms crossed, refusing to meet my eyes, and my younger brother Desmond hovered at the top of the stairs, too scared to say anything at all. They threw me out for dropping out of medical school. 3 years of my life poured into organic chemistry textbooks and anatomy flashcards, 3 years of my father introducing me at dinner parties as my daughter, the future doctor, and I had ended it all with a single phone call telling them I was withdrawing from my final year at Columbia's medical program. What they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly known, standing there in that cramped hallway with its peeling wallpaper and its smell of my mother's overcooked pot roast, was that I had spent the last 2 years secretly trading in the stock market with money I'd saved from tutoring gigs and a small inheritance from my grandmother. What started as $112 in a brokerage app during my second year of medical school had turned into something else entirely by the time I quietly withdrew from my program. I hadn't told anyone because I didn't need anyone's permission to make decisions with my own money, and because some part of me knew that if I told my father, he would find a way to make it about him, about the embarrassment, about the wasted tuition, about the story he told his colleagues at the hospital where he worked as chief of surgery. So I kept it quiet. I kept everything quiet, because they didn't know I was worth $42.5 million. It happened slowly, then all at once, the way these things do. A position I'd taken in a biotech startup during my sophomore year, back when I was still pulling all-nighters studying for organic chemistry exams, had exploded after an FDA approval nobody saw coming. I'd diversified into renewable energy funds, into a handful of tech companies I believed in before anyone else did, into real estate trusts that quietly compounded while I sat in lecture halls memorizing the brachial plexus. By the time I was 26, I had a financial advisor named Cordelia Whitfield who I spoke to twice a month on burner calls I took in stairwells so my roommates wouldn't overhear. I had an accountant. I had a portfolio that most 50-year-old hedge fund managers would have envied. And I had a father who thought I was throwing my life away because I told him medicine wasn't for me anymore, that I couldn't spend my life pretending to want something that made me feel like I was disappearing a little more every single day. Standing in that doorway with my bag over my shoulder, I didn't argue. I didn't cry, though my throat felt tight enough to choke on. I just nodded, walked past my mother without a word, and stepped out into the cold October air of the driveway where my beat-up Honda Civic waited for me like the only friend I had left in the world. I sat behind the wheel for a long moment, watching my breath fog up the windshield, listening to the sound of my father's front door slamming shut behind me with a finality that felt less like an ending and more like a door finally opening somewhere else entirely. I drove 2 hours to a motel off the interstate that night, the kind with flickering neon signs and thin walls, and I lay on top of the scratchy comforter scrolling through my portfolio on my phone until 3 in the morning. The numbers hadn't changed. They were still mine. Nobody could take them from me, not my father's disappointment, not my mother's silence, not the years of being told what I was supposed to become. Somewhere between the exit signs and the dark highway, I had made a decision that I hadn't fully admitted to myself until that exact moment lying in that motel room. I wasn't going back. Not to beg forgiveness, not to explain myself, not to shrink myself back down into the daughter they thought they knew. The next morning, I called Cordelia before the sun had even fully risen, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. I told her I was ready. Ready to stop hiding. Ready to stop living smaller than my own life. Next day, I moved to my Manhattan penthouse, a property I had quietly closed on 8 months earlier and left sitting empty, furnished but unlived in, like a secret I'd been saving for exactly this kind of morning. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, 42 floors above the streets where nobody knew my name, and for the first time in years, I let myself breathe. 3 weeks later, everything changed again, in a way I never could have prepared for, in a way that would bring my father back into my life whether either of us wanted it or not. 3 weeks into living in my new penthouse, I had finally settled into a rhythm that felt like mine. Mornings started with coffee on the balcony, watching the city wake up beneath me, then hours spent on calls with Cordelia and a small team I'd started building to manage the businesses I was quietly acquiring. I had told no one in my family where I'd gone. No forwarding address, no phone calls, no explanation. I wanted distance, real distance, the kind that lets a person figure out who they are without a chorus of other voices telling them who they should be. But distance has a way of collapsing when you least expect it, and on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in years, my brother Desmond's name flashing across the screen. He told me our father had collapsed at the hospital during a 12-hour surgery, that his heart had simply given out from years of stress and stubbornness he refused to acknowledge, that he was stable now, but the medical bills were already climbing past anything their insurance would touch, and that our mother didn't know what to do. I sat there on my penthouse balcony with the phone pressed to my ear, feeling something complicated twist in my chest, not quite anger, not quite forgiveness, something closer to the strange grief of loving someone who never learned how to see you clearly. Desmond didn't ask me for money. He didn't even know I had any. He just wanted someone in the family to know, because he was scared, and because despite everything, I was still his sister. I didn't decide right away. I let the information sit with me for 2 full days, turning it over the way you turn over a stone looking for what's underneath. On the 3rd day, I called Cordelia and asked her to quietly arrange for the hospital bills to be covered in full through an anonymous foundation transfer, something clean, something with no strings and no name attached that could be traced back to me. I wasn't ready to walk back through that front door. I wasn't ready to hand my father the satisfaction of being right about anything, but I also wasn't willing to let my mother lie awake at night doing math on a legal pad, wondering how they'd survive this. Some choices aren't about forgiveness. They're about who you decide to be even when nobody's watching. 2 weeks after the surgery, my father was discharged and recovering at home, and it was Desmond who told him, against my wishes, where the money had actually come from. He said our father sat in silence for almost an hour after hearing it, staring at the kitchen table where he'd once screamed at me to get out and stay out. I didn't hear from him directly, not that day, not the day after. It took him nearly a month to work up whatever courage or humility it required for a man like him to dial a number he'd deleted in anger. When my phone rang and I saw his name for the first time in months, my hands actually shook before I answered. His voice was different than I remembered, quieter, worn down at the edges in a way that surgery and pride hadn't managed to do before. He didn't apologize right away, because men like my father don't know how to do that easily, but he asked me questions he'd never asked before. How I built what I built. When I started. Why I never told him. I told him the truth, that I didn't tell him because I already knew what his face would do, the exact shape his disappointment would take, and I couldn't survive shrinking myself back into someone smaller just to make him comfortable. There was a long silence on the line, and then he said something I never expected to hear from him in my entire life. He said he was proud of me, and that he was sorry, 2 words that had never once existed in the same sentence together in our house. We didn't fix everything in one phone call. Trust doesn't rebuild that fast, and I wasn't interested in pretending it did just because his voice had softened. But we started talking again, slowly, carefully, the way people do when they're relearning each other from scratch. He came to visit my penthouse for the first time last week, standing at those same floor-to-ceiling windows I'd stood at alone 3 weeks after he threw me out, and I watched him take in the city skyline in silence, finally understanding what I'd built without him, and maybe finally understanding who I actually was. I don't know exactly where this goes from here, whether we'll ever be what we were supposed to be to each other, but for the first time in my life, I'm not shrinking myself down to fit inside his expectations, and neither of us is pretending that doesn't matter. If this story moved you even a little, if you've ever had to walk away from people who couldn't see your worth until it was too late, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. Because this channel is full of stories just like mine, real stories about walking away, standing tall, and building a life nobody can take from you again.